Alrighty, call to order the January 17th, 2025 meeting of the Budget Finance and Growth Committee. We are short one board member today. He's on a little vacation still, probably somewhere warmer than we are. Board member Crossett will be in our next meeting, so we'll hold off on doing selection of a chair, so I'll serve as pro tem for today's meeting. But in the tradition of all of our other Budget Finance and Growth Committee meetings, we'll go around and introduce who all is in the room. Let's start with Davis, and then when we get back around to Rob, if you want to tell folks online how to participate in the hearing of the public, when it gets back to you.
Good morning, Phyllis Davis, the board's administrative assistant.
Good morning, Lauren Roberts, Chief Audit Executive.
Good morning, Jen Wagner, Treasurer and Chief Financial Officer.
Good morning, Michael Gustin, Assistant Treasurer.
Kevin Ashley, Director of Financial Reporting and Transparency.
Brandon Craig, board member.
Eve Bolton, board member. Good day, Shauna Murphy, Superintendent.
Good morning, Nan Haygood, State and Federal Programs Manager.
Good morning, Emily Bell, Ashley, Local 232. Good morning, Michelle Dunn, Cincinnati Federation of Teachers, Local 1520.
And Robert Wilson, Technician. If you'd like to speak during the speaking of the public session of the meeting today, please click the hand icon. We'll ask you for your name and association to the district, and we'll invite you to speak at the end of the meeting. Thank you.
All right. The other part, we have two things still left in our old business. One is just the treasurer search updates. We are still in the process of the treasurer search. And folks, if you have not applied and are desiring to apply, please do. If you have about a week left in what we have it open for. And once we have received all the folks we're going to receive, we will at that point, then the board gets a chance to sit down, look at the applications and determine who we're going to move on to the next stage, which would be the interview process. And depending if we have millions of people apply, or if we have, 7 or 8, maybe determine how big a process we have. I hate to say we have 1 million people apply, but we are still working with the OSBA to gather folks in as candidates. The other part of old business here is we had a couple policies from last year. One was a cash balance policy, and the other was the fixed asset policy that we were going to move to policy committee. And so, Treasurer Wagner, if you want to give us a little bit on.
Sure. So the cash policy is actually a new policy that we're requesting for the board to commit to a cash reserve amount. And we calculated an amount to match 60 days of operations. But we're suggesting to phase it in a 5-year period. So what that means is every year we'd have to set $12 million aside of the available revenues in order to start building that cash revenue, the cash balance up to a 60-day balance. And so that's a pretty heavy lift of $12 million. The impact to next year's budget would be take your forecast of revenues, take off $12 million, and then you have $12 million left to spend on your budget. So I don't know if the board had an opportunity to think about whether 5 years is appropriate, or you want to do it faster or slower. So that's the conversation.
And a little bit to Foreman Bolton, a little bit of the background on this is that what our concern is the declining amount of our cash balance meant each year we were, getting lower and lower. And while in theory, yes, you'll get a higher amount when we pass the levy, that as a good practice, we felt it was having a floor amount that we would want to stay above from a cash balance standpoint. There were as they did a kind of review of what other districts did, there are some levels that are probably higher, and there's some practices that say that should be even higher than the 60-day mark. I think I know it was a much higher number at one point that we had looked at.
I think one was like 120 days.
Yeah, you look at everything from 45 to 120.
And so what we kind of talked about at the last meeting of the Budget and Finance Committee last year as well is that we didn't want to do this all in 1 year.
Right.
So doing it over a phased in approach,
Yeah, really.
Rob has the slide up there for it, but and the goal would be that at the end of that 5 year, that we would have this mark of what we were going to do is a 60-day cash balance that we would be able to then maintain as we go forward, so that we would also not be able to tap into other resources where we were having to pull funds, which we had to do before to ensure that we would have funds on hand to do things like payroll and other stuff that we have to do.
And a policy would help, because at the end of every budget cycle, there's always pressure to go and balance the budget using cash, the leftover cash from the prior years. And so, while we've done that to help invest in strategic investments, we don't have the cushion to do that anymore because our revenues that come in twice a year, there's dry months where we're not getting a whole lot of money and we're getting dangerously low in our cash balance in those months. So this will help protect that pressure going forward to dip into that cash savings account, so to speak, to help balance the budget.
Is part of that the fact that we wait so long to go to the voters? If we're at an 8 year,
Yes, I mean, our revenues are not keeping track of the inflationary costs. So we're spending faster than a typical levy cycle would be. But the board has been very proudly, and should be very proud of the fact that we've stretched a 5-year levy into 8 years. And so we've been very frugal with that money. But we just can't, inflation's too high, is increasing too fast for us to continue to do that.
should, looking at, and I think the chairman has spoken well about this in board meetings, that we're looking at the levies and the renewals that we have in the next half dozen years. Should this inform also our levy requests, rather than just operational or whatever that we're, I'd be comfortable if indeed that becomes part of the ask
Sure.
to make that to the public, because I really don't want to not have $12 million every single year, not to spend on the children and the teenagers and the district. But if we can build it into our planning,
Sure.
I could perhaps support this policy.
I think one other aspect of thinking about this, the cash balance policy, is it is also about timing of when we spend. And thinking about that from a budgetary standpoint, right? So we don't want to, because to the treasurer's point, there are times where our revenue just does not come in. Right, and so if
Like any family.
if our expenses at that time are so high as to we would have to be tapping into the cash balance, I think it's a mindset change as well. So it's not just the additional money to keep reserves, it's also a change in mindset about making sure we're paying attention to the timing, because to that point, things are not getting cheaper. They're only getting more expensive. And so, and we can see that in how our budget has been for the last couple of years, where things that we budgeted for and said this would be the amount, but by the time we're able to actually do it, it has a different cost to it.
Right.
And that's been another part of those factors that have been carrying away the dollars we have on hand. But I think your point, I mean, again, about us looking at that from what do we ask for these next few levies coming up? I think we were talking a little bit about it last time, and I think we're gonna explore it next meeting, but what is the dollar amount that we need to ask for this, at least for this operational levy that we have coming up, that includes the preschool promise, but also includes a hefty sum that is part of CPS's budget.
Great, thank you.
Other thoughts on?
Just ask for consideration around those things that come up that are unexpected throughout the school year. So for example, right now, we are dealing with the surprise of the cost of a detail officer and their hourly rate increasing dramatically. And the question is, well, how are we going to do this? Because we have to have that support at our various events, but we didn't account for that. So that's just one lovely example.
Yeah, and so in past practice, we built a contingency line into the budget The last few years, we haven't been able to do that because of budgetary challenge, balancing challenges. But you're right, we've always had a sizable contingency to deal with, sudden shifts in enrollment where we have to hire more teachers or paras, surprises like that. The state coming down and saying you now have to do a third grade guarantee and you're held accountable yesterday. And so we've always had a contingency line in the budget to accommodate those things. So that would be great to build in. So, and what I'm hearing is that we should go back and kind of think about how to work it into a levy, then we'll bring it back here before saying it into policy.
I'd be more comfortable because I know our inclination is to ask for the least amount of the best amount.
An 8. The 8
Yes.
is the magic number.
Yes, and I think maybe we have to leave that thinking. Because it just is too restrictive for us to do it. I think it's helped us
Mhm.
with our credibility with the community.
Yeah.
And we have a great passage rate for any school district, let
Mhm.
alone an urban one. But yeah, maybe as to the chair's point, we contemplate some of this. Maybe we ought to be building the fiscally responsible things as well as our operational needs as well.
And again, I think from what we would put together from a policy end of it, I think the hope is that whatever that phase in cycle looks like
Mhm.
would be. We'd leave ourselves enough leeway in the policy to adjust for things like the levy concerns that we might have, or other things that might be other factors that would require us to deviate from. And I don't know that, I know at least in the draft that was there, I don't know, we have anything that would be the deviations or the exceptions or that type of category, but I think that might be, that would be helpful.
Yeah, we can write language in there that says, deviation from this policy must take a majority vote of the board or something like that. I don't know.
Because I do think there are situations where, and again, unfortunately, we have a wonderful state who loves all public schools. But there are things that make some, city's really winning me over these days.
Yeah.
But that they may put things out there at times where we may not be at a cash-rich stage of which we would then have to be covering or paying for unexpected changes to things that might happen. So I think that's another thing that the board would then should make a decision as to whether or not how we would handle that.
So what guidance do you have to set the budget target for fiscal year 26? Because right now I'm using a $12 million set aside. And we need to get moving.
I think, because you were gonna do basically, it's an increase each year of,
It's just 12 million set aside for each year based off of the forecasted revenues.
I think you have to wait till the policy passes, and it'll pass probably before the budget is done.
Done, but I had to set a target in order to start giving guidance on building. Okay,
You can set your target, but you need the support of that policy, whether it starts this year versus next year. I don't know.
And I think it probably would be helpful to determine that if it's also shared, then what does that mean financially in terms of what level of cuts will need to be made and which is the better decision. The 12 million, and also considering then what that, or whatever the target is, 12 million or not, and then what level of cuts we would then have to work through in order to meet that target.
so
I think, and I mean, I think for right now, if we keep the 12, and then we have a board retreat or
yes,
board workshop that we can finalize that number
yes,
prior to us getting too far into the budget cycle.
right.
So I think that might be helpful, and then I think we also will have at least one board meeting before that. So that might be something we just add to we can put in to add to the board agenda,
Okay.
board meeting agenda to bring the topic up for us to then discuss at the retreat. Because I do think even if we did something where we phase it in at different amounts than like even amounts, based on kind of what we do from a levy ask and that kind of stuff, we still need to make some sort of commitment to it this year. And so what that commitment looks like, maybe what we as the board need to make a decision on sooner. To give
Okay.
you all
Sure.
space
Yeah.
to make those adjustments.
Yep.
And while we're on that topic, I do think it, and I don't know what the superintendent has in mind, but, or any of us do, but I do hope that our work session on February 1st, and the vast majority of the time be spent on issues of finance and budget to get us kind of back on track.
Levy, yeah.
I think we've got levy decisions that have to be made and long-range planning, but also a budget and budget priorities. I honestly, I know that we've spent a tremendous amount of time on the growth plan of public time and also administrative time, but I think if we can really get into the finances and spend that and suggest that to President Moffett, I think that would be useful coming from the Finance Committee and from the treasurer and from the superintendent, if superintendent feels that that's needed too.
The other policy that we had looked at last time was around fixed assets. Again, I think this was more of a modification or
It's just updating some federal standards.
and so I think there wasn't any concerns last time, I don't believe, and so I think that one's one. So you can get you a copy of it before involved, but I think that might be one that just changing amounts and then changing a few words here or there. To reflect what we have to actually keep track of as far as fixed assets. But getting into our new business. Oh,
I'm
yeah.
sorry, so you're okay with the fixed asset goes forward to policy, cash balance comes back here?
Yes.
Just making sure.
And then just make sure we get a copy of the policy to Boardman Bolton and Boardman Cross. It's just so they're aware of it as well. I know we presented it at the last.
Yeah, I think they're on board docs, but we could
Yeah.
make sure they're emailed. Yep.
Right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And again, some of the, like, just to be very clear, some of this was stuff like the amounts that we were supposed to be, responsible for as a threshold. Those are things that we're trying to match up to the federal standard. What language is considered, like when you get rid of an asset, all these type of things that we're just being very clear to make sure that they match up to what's supposed to be done. Cool. Going to new business. Back to you, Treasurer Wagner, and your team.
Yes, so we're here to present what's today, what's February, today's January, December results. Sorry, I'm working in 3 years at the same time, so it's hard to remember what year I'm in. And so I will turn it over to Mr. Ashley, who gives us start off with our financial reports.
Good morning. Good morning. So I'll skip past, like I usually mention, this is kind of a summary we include. So if someone looks at the report, doesn't hear the presentation, they can kind of have an idea of some of those key things, but we'll just go through the graphs. This slide shows all funds, where our cash is sitting at the end of December. So you'll see talk about low point in the year. We're waiting very much so for our county tax advances. We did get a small one this week, but with bills just being mailed this week and due in a couple weeks, hopefully in about 2 weeks, we'll see a big influx at that point. But at this point in December, the blue is our operating cash, the U.S. Bank general account primarily, that we had at that point, 44 million. Star Ohio is a little bit less because we've been utilizing those funds to meet our obligations. So it's about 15 million at the end of the year. Long-term investments has been pretty consistent, about 77 million that Red Tree manages for us. And then debt related that Red Tree also manages. I believe that's 39 million for debt sinking funds. Next slide.
Does everybody know what debt sinking fund is? It's like a saving, it acts like a savings account where we make our principal and interest payments into that account. So when the principal becomes due, the money's already set aside to make that payment. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, and 2 of those will mature here soon, and then the other one I think goes out about 6 years. But so the next slide this is U.S. Bank general operating account only. So we were just kind of continuing to show how the peaks and valleys of that general operating account. And as you can see, we were at about 21 million at the end of the year. Additionally, we have access to the Star Ohio dollars as well. Next slide is kind of broken down by fund type. Again, you'll see the general funds at 76 million. Once we get those tax advances, it will spike up here in the next month or so. The only one that's negative is the state and federal grants that basically we're waiting on reimbursements from the Department of Education and Workforce. But that's fairly minimal at that point. Again, the total's 176.8 million, which ties back to the general ledger total. The next slide is these focus on general fund. The two columns on the right being the current year. So 76 million was the general fund cash balance at the end of December. You'll notice it was higher last year, and we footnoted there that's because we did the $75 million in tax anticipation notes that we received in December, which kind of changed the timing of, instead of getting tax revenue in February, we got we issued those proceeds in December. Next slide. This is a 3-year history of the cash balance of the general fund. Again, the peaks and valleys you can see, but where we were at the end of December, again, 76 million.
Just pause you for a second, Kevin. This is another part of the discussion that we were having with cash balances related to the pattern we've seen with these year-to-year cash balances, how they go down each year, with the exception of last year where we had the tax anticipation notes, which is the reason we had to do the tax anticipation notes.
Exactly.
So it's just recognizing that was part of the background of the policy.
Also note the peaks in July and February is typically when we get our property tax revenues. So you have to manage your investments in your cash balance to ensure that June and December don't drop too low.
Like in a little school theater, the municipal pays for everything. Football, baseball,
Right.
few amounts paid for everything.
But I think it has been a good planning tool for us.
Definitely a better communication tool, yes.
Yeah, because I think we've tried to have a better handle on it. Especially as those balances do go down for us. So next slide is general fund comparing revenues. The third column is the current year. The fourth column is the budget. So we're about 50% to be expected. Our spring settlement's usually a little higher than fall settlement. I don't know if it's that people pay a full year, and so that all gets distributed in the first half, but we'll see that go up a little bit more too, I think, once we get that. The other nuance, obviously the pink column is the tax anticipation note last year. But when you take that out, it seems like every year we have something, and so we'll continue to have that for forever and ever. But
we got rid of school-wide pool.
yeah, got rid of school-wide pool, the pass-through funding, all that stuff.
You're smiling.
So just when we think we're past something, there's always something else. But next slide. Again, this is 3 years of history for revenue, just month by month. Kind of to give some perspective on that. Next slide is now moving to expenditures. Again, the third column is the current year 304 versus the budget of 664. Here I'm just breaking down salaries and benefits. So salaries and benefits are up about $11.5 million. At this point, January is a 3-pay month this year. I'm not sure off the top of my head what it was last year. So there could be some timing with that.
Would you mind going back a slide for a second to slide 11?
Sure.
Yeah, I just want to point something out. So you see in February and March, you have a peak one year in February and a peak in March in another year. So we're really at the mercy of the Hamilton County Auditor as to when they pay us, when they collect, because if they delay bills, they delay payment, we get our funds late. So it becomes even tricky. If there's a delay, we have to guard against that delay to make sure that we have enough cash to cover all expenses. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's not always under our control.
Thank you, Kevin.
Sure. So we'll go on to the next slide. Again, this is expenditures by month. The peaks and valleys a lot of times are the 3 pay months. The next slide is the unallocated or unencumbered. And just pointing out, about 5.9% of the budget is technically not encumbered. It's appropriated, but either is not in a PO form or may never become a PO form if it's a direct payment. But that's fairly consistent with last year, percentage wise. And then the next slide is cash flow.
Yeah, guess the next slide is mine. So as Mr. Craig knows, we always talk about positive cash flow months versus negative. December is a particularly bad one, so I'll say that. But hopefully the idea is January would be a positive cash flow month once we start getting tax advances. Only things kind of in here that are look a little interesting. Other revenues versus state share property taxes. That looks a little interesting. We just had to do a correcting journal entry there. So deposited the money incorrectly the first time, caught it, corrected it, but it had flipped a month. So sometimes when you do these reports every month, you have to report the interesting looking things as well. And then on expenses, purchase services were up over last month, and a lot of that was just transportation invoices being paid. So
before we kind of keep moving forward to the next section, these from this part, I just want to see if there are any questions. Cool. Keep us going then.
Sure. So the next area is preschool. One of the new slides we've put in the last couple months is just taking the data from preschool to show the buckets for students and how they allocate the funding. The preschool expansion is the levy dollars, which are how do we say this, Jen? I'm sorry.
Last dollar in.
Last dollar in. So you can see that these are the different categories that they break them down, but any of them that say expansion includes those dollars. At the end of December, the total enrollment in preschool a snapshot at this point was 1,940. And then the next slide shows traditionally how we've calculated tuition assistance, which will have some changes next year that we'll have to work through. But currently you can see 741 of those 1,900 students received some level of tuition assistance during the month. And one of the things we've highlighted the last couple months is the EC grant funded seats were increased from 550 to 600, with 120 seats being part of the state full day pilot. So since the levy dollars are last in, that's kind of affected the number of students receiving that benefit. And then the next slide is kind of an income statement for the preschool expansion. The middle column, 7.4 million in revenue. Again, we'll see the other tax settlement being posted soon. United Way 4.8 or 4.5, about half of the budget has already been remitted to United Way. And continue to overspend that allocation a little bit as we've highlighted each month. The next slide, again, is just kind of visual representation of the number of students that receive some level of tuition assistance. And again, it's a little lower this year because of those things we mentioned, the pilots and the EC grant seat changes. And that's it for preschool.
Pause there for full questions.
Do you want to do it now? You want to talk about
Yeah,
it?
thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question about preschool. Looking at the private providers, last report, I mean, there's still seems on their view to be preschool, and probably we can't answer this in here, but preschool deserts. And I don't know that they identified them geographically, but they continue to say that there are some. And I don't know if there's a way that we can see what those are. We know that there's going to be this renewal. And I think that whether or not there remain preschool deserts is part of whether or not the renewal gets expanded or remains the same. And then also, again, the emphasis that we are not credited for these 1,900 kids in our state funding. If I'm in the way that the other K-12 is, how does the state help us with preschool funding?
So the 1,900, we get funding for preschool disabilities. So there's probably 250, almost to 300 students in that 1,900 that are funded by the state.
Great.
There are state grants, the EC grant, and then there's federal grants, Head Start and Title I that help with preschool. There's probably 6 different sources and last time I think we spent about $13 million a year. I mean, don't quote me on that, but we can go back and do a holistic analysis again. But I have a question about how do you define a desert?
Exactly. And they've used a person and a group that does their research, and it might be great to see what that criteria would be. The idea is it's not accessible geographically, or there's not enough services or enough seats for, I mean, those are some of the things that's come up, but I think it'd be great if we all had the same definition, or we all did agree or didn't agree that there are deserts. When this started, there were major deserts throughout the district, and I'm hard pressed to think, especially how we have spread our units literally throughout the district, that would still be some deserts. And I think the public's going to need to know those other sources that you just mentioned, the state and the federal, for the disabilities and what have you, so that we are really presenting a fair picture of what the cost of preschool is. Because I'm starting to hear some rumblings from other sources that there might not be as much support in the groups that helped create this incredible partnership. So I just think we need to be really on top of whatever the information is.
Okay.
I know we had Preschool Promise did their presentation at our, I think it was November meeting or October, one of the two. And I do think the issues that we saw a couple years ago with regards to preschool deserts, which were majority of which were where we had more students than we had seats, than necessarily where there were places that were offering preschool. I think that to a certain extent, there are still places where, and we see it because we have wait lists, right? Like we know that we have places in our city where that's still true. I think Superintendent mentioned that we'll be getting a presentation around some of the work that's being done right now, some of the preschool programming. I do think it's worth noting our numbers are definitely higher than they were when we first started the effort through the preschool expansion. There are other opportunities being offered, like some of the ECE and some of that type of stuff that has fluctuated a little bit. I think the thing we do have to figure out is there a kind of balance point at which we can support the students within the classrooms, within the resources we have to put towards them, given that we got limited funds on these different pockets, and especially given what we would have to make a request for with regards to the levy. Because I do think that's the other part of the discussion point is what we budget for well exceeds what the levy has allocated for preschool each year. And we've been able to do that because we underspent those first few years. Well, now we're kind of ending the underspent dollars. But I know the superintendent had talked at the last meeting about doing a presentation on.
Yes, we do have a presentation scheduled for Wednesday, the 22nd. We are focusing this presentation on CPS preschool classrooms. So yes, Vera will be there to talk about how we're using our resources well.
The only other thought that I just wanted to add on to what you mentioned earlier is I do think the other part that we have been discussing, and I think maybe this is Kevin, you can give a little bit more of an explanation on this, but I think with the change in how some of these dollars are being calculated and figured out and where students fall within and that kind of deal, it has presented the challenge of, okay, so how do you do a comparison of year to year? When like we look at what we're funding for this part, this year we may be only funding this amount, but we may be funding more of this part of it.
Well, and that's why we started adding the one slide where it has the students and all their different funding sources, because only isolating on the preschool expansion students, it had showed a negative story, which wasn't accurate. We're still serving 1,900 preschoolers.
Right.
And so we will, plan to do, we'll watch Vera's presentation, and then we can follow up in February with a larger financial picture if needed.
That'd be great. I do know, dating back all the way to the very, very beginning of the negotiations for this partnership and the first request from the public, they're always, and even coming out of Denver, where they're the ones that kind of started this whole thing. There was always a question as to what is the saturation market for preschool, because throughout, forget our private providers that are part of the network, there are many, many other private providers through churches and
Right.
other organizations. And this is a fairly conservative place in the country. And whether or not there is even an interest in having that 100% of the kids that are preschool age would actually be going to preschool, not necessarily in Southwest Ohio or Hamilton County. So it might not be a bad idea to look at some of the demographics too, because we may have hit where we are. And especially, I know our big concern has always been to hit the right kids, meaning the kids that would perhaps most benefit from the preschool experience more than perhaps others. But it might be interesting to look at some of those demographics and what percentage of that age population is actually partaking and what families are choosing to do this, because we're not really aware of all the other private opportunities people have, not just homeschooling, but also a good example is in my neighborhood, the Presbyterian Church. And people want their kids to go to the church preschool or childcare for some obvious and good reasons.
I think the other thing, Superintendent, is that we can do much later, because I don't think we would do it right now, is one of the things we talked about in the agreements reached with CPP was to look at the number of students who come from the private CPP providers into the district. Because we did, part of the story that I think CPP made and they have a wonderful video. Like the video was amazing, it was definitely moving that they provided in October. But one of the stories they talk about is the kindergarten readiness of students who go through and have preschool education. And like how much they're able to move faster and be more prepared. And I think that's a story to also, if they're coming to our schools, and our students are also in that same belt, that's that beautiful story that we're able to tell for the levy, right? That's a beautiful thing that we're able to put out there. I know myself, Gordon Lindy and Dr. Moffat were all very touched by the fact that the kid in the story talks about how great an experience they had, and how so much that built up their next experiences and prepared them for school, and like how they look down at their younger siblings, and that type of thing is a great story that we have. And I think that's sometimes what we need for these levy conversations is the story. So it'd be great to kind of get a chance to expand that conversation point. Right. All righty, well, let's keep it moving now to state and federal grants.
All right, the next slide. Thank you. This is showing our trend slide of our spending. As you can see, we're continuing to trend upwards on our spending. We're significantly ahead of prior years, because we've just really been spending a lot of time with budget managers and principals and really focusing on trying to get that spending done in the year of the award. That number does represent the initial allocation of the 55 million. It does not include the carryover yet because those funds really just came in November, December. So really the managers didn't get access to them until, mid-December, and not a lot of spending happens then. So next slide. So this just showed you the breakdown. The 58% does now include the carryover funds. So even with carryover added in, 58% of our grants are at or above the 34% target. Again, without that, it's at 47%. I'm at 37%. All right, the next slide. So I went ahead and just brought in the carryover numbers. I thought that you would be interested in seeing the amount of carryover by most of our ESEA entitlement grants. These are our, majority of high dollar grants that impact the students. So we had about 40%, increase in our total allocation based on the carryover coming in, which brings us up to our 52 million. Of that, I went ahead and broke it down between the non-publics and the public. So you can see about 12% of that goes to our non-public, private schools, Catholic schools, and so on. And so that's where we're at. There might be some slight changes as the state does some reallocations of swept funds, but that should be pretty close to where we stand for the rest of the year on these major grants. All right, the next slide. So this breaks down our spending in our major entitlement grants. And, again, as reflected in the first slide, you can see that we are continuing to spend at a pretty healthy rate. We really jumped in early this year on some of our major grants. Especially Title I, Title IV. And, we're really just taking this seriously to apply these funds, to the students that they're awarded to. I did include our fiscal year 24 carryover amounts in the right. As you remember during some of our previous discussions, those are the funds that expire at the end of this year. So I like to just keep that as a reminder of this is the minimum amount that we would always need to spend in these grants to make sure we don't get swept. And we really had an amazing year. I felt like this year we only had one grant, which was the neglected funds that were affected by the sweeps this year. Everything else we spent out timely enough that we kept our money. So that's always our number one goal. And then the next slide, ESSER, pretty much was wrapped up in December. We did our final, rebalancing and spending during December. All of our final reports were due in December. It's going to go on, I'm sure, for a few more years for follow-up and audit and things like that. But I thought it would be useful just to, take a minute to reflect on the next slide. What did we do with all that money? We had about $325 million that came into the district. And so this is just kind of a really high level look at what we accomplished and how we focus those funds. And so you can see the number one category that we spent those funds on is facilities. So that included several very large additions, as well as a lot of renovations with HVAC and roofing and things that would impact, the safety and the health of the students. So that was our largest area. Following that was technology at 19%. And obviously, as it first hit us and we moved to remote learning, we had a lot of technology needs to get devices in the hands of students. And so that kind of makes sense. And then the third area, which was one of the board's goals, was to protect staffing, not to lose staffing, over the situation that we were in. So the third category was staffing. And then on the next slide, I felt like it would just kind of be interesting to see by the three primary grants. So these are just the actual ESSER large things to see kind of how our spending shifted over the year. So the first, ESSER funds, which came in at 20 million, during that time, we were just in response mode of, how to really deal with the crisis. And so it makes sense that a lot more of that money was spent on health and safety because we were just trying to get our, our facilities in a safe place. Then as we shifted into ESSER 2, you know, that one kind of covered both periods where the students were doing remote learning and then starting to come back to school. And so the focus there really was on staffing and on the technology of making sure the kids had what they needed to be able to complete their lessons at home. And then really as we kind of moved into ESSER 3, which, you know, all of these grants kind of overlap a little bit, but really ESSER 3, a lot more, the kids and the students were coming back to school. And so those funds are targeted a little bit more towards learning loss and, you know, just catching up from the impact of COVID. And so it's, you can kind of see where the money went, that it was kind of shifting as our goals and our intents shifted over that time. And so that's pretty much it. I just thought ESSER deserved a kind of a send off.
Yeah.
From the district.
These will be the last ESSER slide.
It was fun.
Board Member Bo.
I particularly like the rest in peace. I would say these 3 or 4 charts that you just shared with us, it might be the last presentation in finance, but these are going to have to be core parts of any renewal request we're making about anything. Because the public, that's the first or third question, is what did you do with the ESSER funds? And the way you've laid it out, the percentage is interesting, but the timing shows actual accountability. It shows that there was planning. It wasn't just, you know, having the fan on and throw the money in the air. This is bedrock for the public to understand what it is. And I don't know, I'm going to believe that you're saying all this is true, but I'm telling you, showing it in that time as the function and the timing of the function makes complete sense, and it will help.
And that the spending rules changed as time went on.
And I think you say something
And they
like that
constantly
too,
revised.
that there were
them.
these
Mhm.
criteria. I really think that you're gonna, one of the bedrock, one of the planks of passing all these levies and renewals that are coming up is gonna be to prove how we spent the ESSER.
So keep this in mind when we get to the Just Ask Jen schedule, because there
Uh-huh.
might be a way to work that in.
I wrote Just Ask Jen on the thing when this is
It'll be
It's-
Just Ask Jen and Nan.
absolutely, a great job. That's very important stuff. Because people still are, it's like 25 years of listening.
Thank you.
Well, what did you do with the gambling money? What did you do with the lottery money?
Mhm.
Yeah,
That was a bait and
37
switch.
cents.
It was all
Yeah.
bait and switch.
Total bait and switch, but
Yeah.
but it's part of the
Okay.
legend. Just like this ESSER money now is going to be used to tear us down. We can't let it.
So, as Nan talked about carryover money is in the grant, it's time for us to do an appropriations resolution revision to allow us to spend the money that's coming in. We will also be, so Kevin's handing out a draft. We'll also be asking for an increase in the general fund by $500,000 because we need to start ordering stuff for the growth plan, furniture and lockers and stuff like that. And, we just don't have space in the current budget to do next year's buying. So it'll be a small increase to the general fund to help kick off the growth plan so that we're ready when school opens. Questions?
No, I mean, I think, you know, again, understanding that it's always
Can you
nice to spend
share?
carryover money and get it
Give
out,
her mine.
get it out the door.
That's good.
So, and again, I think I maybe want to highlight one little thing that we glossed over a little bit because we talked about it month after month. But the percentage of funds that we are now spending on time or before schedule is huge. And I think this growth, and I know Dr. Moffitt, she was here with, you know, without the question she asked year after year. But I honestly do believe it's really because there is a change in mentality about how we spend dollars that is really taking grip in a lot of the schools and a lot of the different folks who have budgets. Because there was that mentality of, well, we wait till the end of the year so that we could spend all the dollars, you know, make sure we have enough money at the end of the year to make it through. And it was like, well, then you get to the end of the year and you can't spend it all because you've waited so long to do so.
Right. So we've transitioned into that. And then at the end of the year, we're saying, no, you can't spend the money. No, you can't do that. No, you can't reject. So we're taking that conversation to the beginning to say, let's plan alongside of you so we can figure out how best to use this fund and when.
But I think it touches into how the carryover dollars, though, I
Mhm.
mean, to your point about we've only had one fund that's been touched or been swept away, it is because of the fact that we are making an active effort to spend better throughout the year. So that when we get to this end, while we may have some carryover funds that exist for other reasons.
Right.
We're not having, you know, if we had a $5 million grant, we're not having 3 million of it still sitting there at the end of the year. We're having some of that spent, and so.
And the only reason that got swept was because we had, what, 4 budget managers in 3 years over that grant? And they just couldn't get educated fast enough to spend the money.
But then the other part, with regards to us taking the steps to,
Mhm.
add in the funds to cover the necessary things, you know, again, we as a board voted to do it, so we have to make sure we're able to support it and fund it. So I think, you know, again, this will be brought to the board next meeting, but board meeting, or,
This, the 27th,
okay,
yes.
all right.
Thank you.
Mhm.
So we're moving on to, in the slides, to return on investment. And so this is the first meeting of the year. We wanted to have a discussion about what topics we wanted to see and get them scheduled. And so Cody went and did a request from colleagues and leadership team members to say, what are you interested in seeing us analyze for return on investment? And you take it from there, Cody.
Yeah, absolutely. Next slide, Mr. Rob. So like Jen said, we did it like you see in the column request origin. The Google form is what I use to send out and get some response and get some feedback on different topics. What we didn't want the ROI efforts to be was a financially dictated decision, but more of a collaborative effort across the departments and across the district to educate the public and educate ourselves on the different topics of return on investment as this process grows. Really looking at ROI as a whole, it's not just the opportunity to make educated budget decisions. That is a huge part of it, but also a lot of these, and what I'm trying to work with budget managers on, is establishing that process of ROI. What does that look like in your program? Do we have the tools now? Do we need tools? Do we need data? What do we have? How can we collaborate and build that relationship together that further makes these budgeting decisions easier in the future? I think some people hear the word ROI and they immediately like, well, if my ROI is not good, they're getting rid of my program. That's not necessarily the case. That can be a decision made by leadership and the board in future decisions. But right now it's building that process, building that relationship, getting that understanding, and seeing where we're at with the data and using those decisions to make, or using that data to make smart budgetary decisions. So I was very impressed by some of the different topics that came out, some things I never even thought of, like the International Baccalaureate Program. That was a topic that got brought up, or the internal versus external tutoring. So just looking at different things and the opportunities that are there.
I also wanted to say that Emily and Michelle, if your union leadership have ideas, you're welcome to add topics as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's why I went ahead on the first slide and put tentative in case anybody had different ideas, or we had ongoing input. Some of these, depending on the meeting schedule, we can double up topics as we grow in our process, and really just get that feedback from the public and from the board and of course the unions.
The first 2 topics actually came out of Finance Committee at the last one, so we'll put those first.
Yep. And then next slide, Mr. Rob.
Wait, I think Ms. Bolton has a question.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just I think it's right to ask the union leadership for their participation, and if I think it wouldn't be a bad idea also to ask board members
Yes, ma'am.
from a standpoint to submit. I see things here that board members would say for sure, but there might be some other things that might be of interest. So, and I think that'd be a great interchange in an exchange. So, but thanks for doing this.
One thing, Cody, maybe if we send out something to the board, just also list the ones we've already.
Exactly.
Because I will say, this has been both a labor of probably of love and frustration at times. Over this past year, because.
I plead the fifth.
And a lot of learning though, because we did a few of these where what we recognized and appreciated is the thought beforehand was, oh, well, we can do this because we can figure out what this value is. And then as you go to look at the comparisons, and especially things where we looked at per school spend on stuff, you start to recognize that, okay, well, certain schools do things so differently that it's not a fair comparison to say, this is the dollar per school for this, or maybe high school was different from elementary school spendings. And I know that was one of the things we looked at on a few of these, especially like social workers, some of these others where we have a number that we're gonna do in the unit, but that fluctuates so hard by how many
Right.
kids are in the school and what the school needs.
So, right, these efforts aren't about gotchas and like Cody said, it's more of a collaboration because it could be an opportunity. Well, we didn't get enough funding to finish this stuff, right? Or something happened to prevent us from getting things done. So it's more about problem solving and continuous improvement. But there's also a huge component on educating the public on why we spend money on the things that we spend money on and how impactful it is. So it's a very positive experience.
I will also say, and I know we have one more that I think we're still gonna hit on, which is the under 200,000 vendor review. But I will say, having the different departments come in and talk about how they're making decisions with regard to how they're picking vendors, what the vendor's value has been, what are the KPIs that they've indicated that have been successful, things to do. I mean, I think we had a wonderful discussion when we talked about some of the facility spending.
Correct.
That really was cluing board members into why, okay, so we try to be both green in how we do things, but also not have 12 vendors
Right.
providing a product that one could provide, or having, changing the model of which we order stuff in advance so that you have it on stock and not ordering it to order.
As needed, right?
It's a wonderful conversation that I think my friends at UC should be having, but those are things that I think we gained a lot of value out of hearing the explanation, even, having, I think the conversation we had, that was like an amazing conversation around how are they using our dollars in here? How are they trying to do better to be a more green, a more energy conscious?
Absolutely.
Because that was a commitment of the board and the district. But also recognizing we don't want to do, like, we have to use a certain vendor because trying to do these three others where none of them could provide this particular tool didn't make sense. And so
Absolutely.
giving some of those that you've already used
Yes, sir.
as you kind of get some of the also the ones that we may have new ideas for. Suggestions for.
I do think that's one of the big themes is what to decentralize and what to centralize. If we could come to grips with what we think needs to be decentralized and what needs to be centralized, I think there's savings and productivity in the millions. If we would come to grips with that, and I don't know when that happens or how that, but y'all have laid the groundwork
Right.
to have that make some sort of final
Right,
decision.
and outsource versus insource, but
Absolutely.
so because it's a organizational philosophical decision about site-based management versus site-based decision-making. I don't think our schools are equipped to do site-based management for every operational topic that there's there. And hence centralized enrollment, right? And so those are conversations that we look forward to having.
Well, and that's, again, we're looking at the work Saturday. That's the kind of conversation the board could convene around and have some discussion about the outsourcing and insourcing. We've talked about it for a long time and been a target for a couple of years. As a matter of fact, you brought it as part of the budget target, I think, 2 fiscal years ago, particularly, and then the other centralized and decentralized. That's, I think that would be a great discussion and it should inform the coming budget.
Yes, we do have a process in place that evaluates insource versus outsources as the opportunities arise. And then, but I look forward to this centralization versus decentralization conversation.
I think the one other area that I think Cody and you probably hit some of the ones that we're going to talk through future topics discussion, but we had a kind of, I guess, a longstanding thought process around per students versus per school, looking at costs and expenses that way. And I do think part of the thing that we have learned in some ways on this and looking at these ROIs is some things we do because we have to do it. Right? So like we can sit there and say utilities per building and like look at the cost of utilities per building. We ain't got an option. Unless we're gonna really go green and have no electricity in the building, right? We don't really have an option on that end, but there were other things that we looked at, like assistant principals, like some of those areas where we were looking at whether or not what we've added has been of value and how we're using it. Is this the best value for students that we're getting out of it?
Right.
And so I imagine some things like some of the transportation costs.
Mhm.
We've looked at that from a bigger picture, but never looked at it from an ROI picture,
Mhm.
which will be an interesting one that, but I specifically. The Yonder Pouches discussion
Mhm.
Rob,
is, Yonder Pouches discussion per school may be another one of those things where we may see that it's been really effective and some schools have. They give one pouch and every student keeps over their pouch and that kind of deal. In other schools where we have these different things that might be happening with whether or not students keep them or whether or not students, you know, the machines or that type of deal. All those are things that we can have that I think would be interesting to see. I just don't know what the discussion looks like
Mhm.
until we have it. So it'd be great to have stuff like that come up.
So the per student cost is a philosophical disagreement with me and Egenomics. Egenomics wants to do everything by student, but I think it's misleading to the public when, if you look at technology leases, for example, they don't all go to students. There's adults that are involved. So I think that we need to stop and think about what's the right denominator to use in order to evaluate. Because if you do everything by student, I understand why they're coming from, they want to do it comparatively. I still think it's misleading and it may lead you to a different conclusion.
We saw it like Schedule E dollars,
Mhm.
where, you know, if you did Schedule E dollars by per student. You end up with some schools actually getting less dollars than they are getting now, and then some schools who don't have the programming getting more dollars. Rather than kind of looking at what you're doing in the program and saying, this
Yeah.
is the allocation. So it is sometimes helpful to see per student, but it also may be important to look at whether or not that's the right measure for that particular item.
I think we did something important when we dealt with the APs at smaller schools. That was a bigger decision than I think we fully realize. The cost of small schools is unsustainable. And we have had that for 15 years, in part because of the magnet system. And I think that per school and that per student, while it can't be the panacea, it really, it's as close as you're going to get to some sort of rudimentary equity effort. And even these schools that are in the process of changing now have been among our most expensive schools. And very frankly, we don't like to talk about it, but also from a performance standpoint. It's obvious that there's not necessarily a connection between the amount of money you're spending and the results that you're getting. Why is that? That shouldn't be the case, but it is. And so this whole capacity thing, the whole enrollment piece, all of this has really, I think, kind of been the nut of the whole as we prepare for the future. It's been interesting.
Oh, if you think about it, the whole capacity conversation is a
Absolutely.
return on investment.
Absolutely.
Right. So
No
yes,
question.
Absolutely. Okay, so Cody has up there a list for future topics. He can include that in the thing to the board so everybody knows
Be great.
where the things are coming from. And, you know, we're happy for that conversation to go forward.
And again, we always also appreciate for you, Cody, giving you the time to actually be able to get this information, because I do know that's the other challenge is we're sending Cody out to like 85 different areas of expertise. And so.
Oh, well.
He's getting a good education on.
There you
operations of the
go.
business.
Somebody's got to do it, right,
Be
Cody?
educated while working. It's two birds, one stone. It's good for my future, good for our future.
So I think the next one is the Community Reinvestment Act agreements.
Mike,
We have 3.
3 this month, yeah. And again, LLC names continue to get more and more creative as we go, but
So much better LMC.
right, so much better. But pretty standard things here. You know, commercial space, a hotel, commercial and office space, rental, residential, the usual. Don't really have a lot to say.
Tell them adding to our enrollment.
correct.
Yeah, pretty much zero. Yeah, pretty much zero chance any of these add to our enrollment, so.
Commercial space. So then the next one there is the new policies that we kind of started to talk about last month. Again, we talked a little bit about cash balances, so, but I'm gonna walk through the other new policies that we have been, that kind of came up at the last meeting, and we said we would keep talking about them, walk through, and there's some ideas.
Skip to the student fees.
Yeah, Rob, would you skip to slide 40, please? Thank you, sir. So we'll start, I think, with age student fees. So this is the second time this has come up. We have revised data, revised as of last night data. So I will say this has been quite the data project for our financial technology team to pull from. So kind of just to set the stage. So for years, I mean, before I got here years, we used a system called Pay Schools or Pay For It to assess and collect student fees. And it was linked to our Power School student information system. When we switched to Focus to start this school year, Focus also has a student fee module, which is really, I think, a nice thing for the parents because it gives them a one-stop shop. You know, one login to get in to see your students, information as well as to pay any fees. So I think that's going forward is very nice. But the issue we have is bringing over the old and age fees from Pay Schools into Focus. And obviously it's timely right now because there's a lot of 2025 seniors who are thinking about graduation, and their parents are calling the schools and saying, hey, I want to make sure we're paid up. I want to make sure we're paid up before my kid graduates, which we appreciate. So in Pay Schools, there's about $15.5 million worth of unpaid fees. And part of this is the conversation about the write-off policy, which we don't have at this point. So we've never written anything off. There are ways to waive fees. So usually students get fees waived for economic hardship. Also, schools from time to time will waive fees. What we kind of looked at, we looked through the data was, okay, pulled all this data out of Pay Schools, dug through it. There's like $1.8 million of these fees are things that are obsolete, like obsolete fee types, closed schools. Like there are things that, there's schools that we haven't had open in 10 years, right?
Give them the Burton example.
Yeah, like a locker fee for Burton. Like, okay, so trying to find the person that was associated with who's probably, in their mid-30s now and try to get them back to pay a fee for a closed school could be quite difficult. There are inactive students as well. So a lot of students have left the district. It's actually the mass majority. And this is where kind of the data update happened that we worked on. Is initially we looked at it, we looked at students, it was all students, and then we came back and looked at just active students. So the vast majority is fees assessed to inactive students who are no longer CPS. And then there's about $4 million of fees out there that are for current students attending one of our schools. And we'll stop there for questions.
So, just a comment. So we're recommending that we waive the obsolete fees because the likelihood of us collecting that is probably next to nil. The question on the inactive fees, which is what, 9.6 million, is that what it says up there? Does the board want us to spend efforts trying to collect those fees before we write them off? Or are we, good at writing them off because they're inactive students and we would spend a lot of money chasing these people down? Just looking for some feedback.
I think the other kind of point of clarity, and I don't know if it's I know we talked about it last time around, but like some of these fees date back like to 2006.
Pre-COVID.
2002,
Mm-hmm.
where they were just fees that were never collected at any point in time that, so I mean, I think to your point, there may be some folks in that inactive student list who may have been gone for several years now, and the efforts to try and go get that fund from the families.
And they could have been collected and somebody just didn't mark it in the student's file. We don't know, but it would take a horrendous amount of effort to investigate all that.
So I think there's 2 points here. So one is the actual that we need a policy to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
That's something we have to forward on. But I think the more pressing question of the current situation is, for the inactive students, is that something we would recommend waiving at this point?
Well, I recollect from policy committee 2 years ago that the real discussion was whether or not to have fees at all.
Correct. And so we waived the district-wide fees, and then this year we did not charge any.
Right.
But the schools still charge their own fees.
And I think that that's part of the conundrum
We have a slide on that, yeah.
Yeah, if you, it's ahead. It just, whatever we're spending or whatever I should say, charging for what? I just think that in a district like ours, there's some justification for a feeless district.
So if you look at this slide, the top two lines up there are related to tuition. So if people are not, they're paying tuition because they're required to, either they
Yep.
live out of state. And if they're not paying tuition, that we should not have them enrolled because we're paying for their education without getting a revenue
Right,
source.
and so I don't see tuition as a fee.
Okay. Okay, so we will chase those down. The miscellaneous fees, I don't know what to say about that. Loss and damage items, intercessions, there's $870,000 due for intercession fees.
Of course, I don't necessarily believe in intercession either, so there you go.
That's kind of the cornerstone of the Montessori.
I
education.
totally understand. I know that even better than you do.
The grade level fees are the district level fees, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
grade level fees are your district fees, and that's the biggest bucket.
Yeah.
Obviously, like you said, we stopped collecting new fees, but we didn't do anything with the prior fees. And for the folks in this room who know how this works, generally, when it comes time to graduate,
That's when it happens.
the conversation happens, and a lot of times the conversation is, oh, my kids had free and reduced lunch for the entire 13 years. This parent fills out a form, and then we end up waiving, 13 years worth of, or 12 to 13 years worth of those,
And 4 days of bad publicity.
Yes.
and 4 days of that publicity.
So we're working on a proposal to re-centralize the student fees. Superintendent Murphy and I talked about this about a week or so ago. Because clearly the schools don't have the ability to necessarily collect them on a timely basis. Dr. Moffat asked us, well, are you sending out statements and communicating with the parents? Well, the school fees are the schools collect the fees. We weren't involved.
Right.
So if we re-centralize it, then we can start using the system to establish, invoices and statements and reminders and that kind of stuff moving forward. But we do need to figure out what fees does the board want us to charge? What we're trying to do is just clean up the data, waive the stuff
Right.
that hasn't been collected, and then move forward with the fresh.
I think the other thing we talked about last time, we were kind of opening the discussion out, was there were, again, it's a small portion of things that are like lost damage items, or small portion of things that are, like preschool tuition or out of district tuition or things like that. And that part, yes, like those are things that in some ways we may have a hard time collecting from folks who have been away from the district for 5-10 years to be like, hey, you remember that book you lost that was $12 or whatever that you're now charging this fee for? But I do think as we go forward, and this is maybe to where the policy end of it needs to be, we do have folks who, routinely, we don't want people to sit and wait till their senior year to start talking about those costs, because those stay on our books to look at and have to deal with every year, rather than trying to encourage folks to make those, affirmative statements or those things earlier in the process, so that your kid is not getting X, Y, and Z, or that we're not looking at it and saying, how come you haven't paid for X, Y, and Z or done X, Y, and Z?
Also, when the school's collected in the senior year, are they taking the elementary value and giving it back to the elementary school, right?
Yeah.
And so, there's a lot of
It's
complexities
just
to
an
it.
impossible thing.
That's in part why I think the policy end of it, which is be focused on age student fees, but also maybe thinking about when do we consider something to be aged, right? So is it a year or two
No.
as opposed to 12 years? As opposed to 15, 20 years? Because again, the stuff on the list went back to like before I worked at the district after law school. So I was like, good gosh. Who never collected debt, but they may have, and I think that's another part of the conversation we've been
It's
having
just, it's
about
not working.
centralizing certain aspects and certain tools. That gets a lot into that discussion as to what the policy needs to kind of encapsulate, right? Because
Right.
policy may be specifically for, if the policy is focused on folks who are no longer in the district and HVs, or folks who have left or graduated, I don't know if we're gonna get any different behavior.
No.
But if we maybe look at that 2 to 5 year, whatever that window is of how many years is considered to be aged. We may get people who are still in the district, who are still current students, who we can start to really change the behavior, and at least the communication with the parent to say, hey, you're on year 4 of not paying for your student when they damage the chemistry lab equipment.
Well,
We need to.
then you have the challenge of, child is with us preschool through 6th grade. They leave the district, go inactive, they owe fees. We write them off. They come back in 9th grade and graduate with us.
Exactly.
So there's a whole lot of complexity to work through.
The piece, and in a school district like Wyoming, you can collect fees because those kids are there. And you'll see them next year. Or you'll teach their parents and the fee, you owe a fee and you've got a kid in the school now. So this is just an impossibility, I think.
But going to a completely feeless
Right.
society is
Very
going to
expensive.
hurt some of our schools because they collect some of our schools collect a significant amount of money
Well,
to use towards their
You know, again,
expenses.
they need to be funded better, I guess. I don't know.
Well,
This
I
is,
think that's the reality, that's a board decision. We have to decide whether or not we want to get rid of all fees.
Exactly.
whatsoever.
Mhm, mhm.
As we sit, we have fees. And we need to decide what we want to do with
Right.
those fees for things. Because I also think there's some ways that some of these things with fees also creates people's good behavior. So if you think I don't have to do anything because nothing will ever happen. to me,
absolutely.
I'm gonna just keep doing what I'm doing.
Mhm.
And I know that that's like for a good portion of some of our non-school grade level fees. There is this pattern of trying to create responsibility with, you keep up with something.
Behavior.
Give you a device, and that's
Sure.
one of the conversations we had about the one-on-one devices. Was that how many of these one-on-one devices are people using, but then how many?
Well, that
of
was
those
a
do they
telling, yes.
Keep up with, or are they coming back to us and saying, so my laptop doesn't work anymore, I need a new one. And that's, I mean, again, I think that's certainly a conversation point to have as to what we charge fees for and what we look at it, and once we kind of, that's a separate conversation from what we do with if we still have fees, what are those fees when they're aged, but I think it also, you have a slide on here also with regard to grade level, I think it's very interesting. While a good portion of them, hey, sorry.
Sorry to interrupt. Dr. Moffat sent a message. The entire board needs to have this discussion. Should this be referred to on the January 7th meeting for discussion? Thank you.
Okay.
What, Janet, what?
Well, so the
27th.
No,
policy needs to go to policy. Whether or not
Yes.
we do a waiving of the fees, we can certainly maybe have that discussion.
Mhm.
So I'll send her something after the meeting, let her know, but yeah, the waiving of fees, the board can make a decision about, but the policy needs to
It's the
actually go to
policy.
policy.
after it's been defined, yeah.
But if you go to the next slide, Rob, I just wanted to highlight just the real quick for.
Those are updated
Oh.
data there, yeah.
Nice.
So it presents a very different picture when the active data is updated.
Yeah, but I think it's in one more, maybe,
The pie chart.
yeah.
Yeah. Next slide, Rob.
I think
That's
the pie
actually
chart
updated
speaks
as well.
to what Treasurer Wagner was actually just talking about also, which is, are these fees technically high school fees, or are they just high school students have fees based on these things that have accumulated?
Exactly.
Because then, you could see 9 to 12, you get certain fees because of things you're doing. Yes, but also could you have fees because you just stop paying on things and they keep moving up the ladder with you?
Right, so the $6.2 million that are grades 9 to 12, how much of it was prior to 9th grade?
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's an updated version of this one too, Rob, if you'll go one slide. Thank you.
Wow.
Yeah, it's
Oh, my Lord, right there, that's the answer.
it's pie, right?
That, it's impossible.
Oh, yeah, that's beautiful.
If a pie chart has more than 6 sections or pieces, just forget it.
But that's again, like that's part of the struggle that we would have to try to get back and forth all these things, so.
It's a stained glass window.
Yeah. So I do think we can add the waiving of the inactive fees and then the obsolete fees to the board agenda.
I will do that in the treasurer's report as a line item for you to vote on.
Perfect.
Awesome.
And then the other fees will have to the other fees for current students, which is now 4 million, I believe it said,
Yeah.
I think that's just something for we to talk about as a board as to what we want to do with fees, but then also from a policy end. What is our age student fees policy going to look like? We had
Right off of the
write off of old debts.
Yes. Next slide, Rob. I think this is second time around. This obviously, this Bolton, first time you've seen it. So we've had, and this is bigger than just a bigger, it's different, it's bigger, but also different than student fees. So we have other fees that we charge folks.
Okay,
You know, just for different things, whether it's, you know, people take COBRA benefits or, you know, trying to get money back from employees with their payment issues. We do not have a way to write these off currently, even if legally we can't collect. So we have a few people
Fix
who
that.
file bankruptcy, we can't collect, but we can't write it off. So we're stuck with this money on our books. And so this policy would just
Great.
allow us to move forward.
And so, I know there's a proposed text, I know we certainly. Rob, you're gonna click on the link to the proposed text. I know part of what and we talked about this last time, part of what we really stressed in this is there were examples of this where it was like. Very low dollar amount that it would have been so much more for us to go in, even if we could collect it.
Good money after bad.
You know, like we're spending more money to collect the dollars than
Exactly.
we're actually getting. Didn't make a whole lot of sense. So the policy's there. Again, I don't want to speak since we don't have Jim here. I think we can wait till the
Yeah.
next meeting to allow Jim to get a chance to read
Yeah.
it over also. But it's not, I don't think there was anything in here that was significantly alarming about what we would do. Biggest probably question marks were about what's the dollar amount. That is the amount we would say you can write off. Yeah, you know, and the authorities write off. But. Next. Let's see.
Next policy is reimbursements, employee reimbursements and per diem, so. Again, it's kind of second time through, so CPS, we do kind of the worst of both worlds. So we reimburse people up to the GSA amount. Plus we require receipts, so GSA amount is an amount General Service Administration sets. Pretty much across, and most companies use it to say, it basically says, okay, how much does it cost for someone to have meals in Cincinnati, right? It's like $68 is their GSA limit. Most companies, a lot of government agencies use that for traveling because it's simple and it's across the country. And then obviously different cities like LA is higher, you know, New York would be higher based on the cost of living there. But yeah, we go up to that limit, but then we also make you provide receipts. So we hit you both ways. A lot of our peers just do a straight per diem GSA limit. So we're not, as Carol Smith says, we're not the food police. So we're not looking at your Olive Garden receipt to see, you know, see what meals you had to make sure you didn't spend enough. We're not checking to see how much you tipped.
That was not an endorsement of Olive Garden.
We're not checking to see how much you tipped your server. You get a flat amount for your meals for those days that you're traveling. That's what you're reimbursed. You don't, no receipts, no back and forth. No, if you want to go have, you know, a very extravagant dinner, that's great. This is the amount you get reimbursed. The rest of it would be on you. And so it's just a lot cleaner. It saves an incredible amount of time. Not only treasurer's office staff, but also everyone who travels who has to keep all those receipts and make sure they're legible and not spill water on them and turn them in, and they have to be reviewed and reconciled and all that. So our ask would be that policy 3440 is coming up for normal regular review as part of policy, is to add a sentence in that allows us to switch from complete reimbursement to per diem.
And this is a topic that actually was raised during an audit committee meeting as well, and that it just is a very labor intensive task for, I believe it's just one person, right, that does the review of all of
Two,
the
actually.
receipts and expenses, and so.
John,
It takes a lot. I mean, the accountants are involved and Carol and other people in the AR are involved, and it's a lot.
it's just a lot of unfortunately, it's a lot of petty fights. Like one thing we don't currently reimburse for is meals within the greater Cincinnati metro area. So if you're sure, so if you're at CVG, get ready to fly out, that meal's not reimbursable. So then someone calls and says, okay, I can understand that, but what if when I'm on the plane, can I order food on the plane while I'm flying? Well, we all know how airline meals are, you know, which one's better for the person, you know, we all know which one's cheaper.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, so it's stuff like that, just a lot of extra work.
I think the other thought with this is, you know, again, both getting more efficient with how we do these things and getting more consistent. But I think one thing I would make sure that we have is whatever system we were using to do the designation of per diem that we're. So like, for instance, at UC, if I go somewhere and I get a per diem, I have to mark off what meals
Mhm.
I'm getting funded for, right?
Yeah.
Like not just a straight daily per diem, because I do think that also gets a little bit into. If I leave at noon, do I get breakfast?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and like that stuff, I mean, that, whatever process we're using to allow folks to make those decisions and determinations to get per
Right.
diem. Is done in a way so that it's
Yeah. So,
simply done and easy to understand.
all right, so we'll see if, well, go ahead. Sorry.
How does it pertain to transportation, meaning, cab rides? Shuttle rides?
This is for meals.
This is strictly for meals.
Meals and incidentals.
Okay, and incidentals. Okay, and then how do we know that the public dollars are not being used by that person to buy alcohol?
You know,
No.
Okay.
It's a per diem. so-
I gotcha, but is there some law about alcohol and the expenditure of
So the one
public
difference,
dollars?
the one difference also with doing per diem is that you would not be putting it onto your P card.
Yes.
So like this would be an amount that you would get given as opposed to you taking your P card, using it and then having to bring the receipt back and show that this is what I used my P card on.
Right.
and just note that this is the same policy that ODEW uses.
Well, of course, they are never my champions
I understand, but
or my role models, but yeah, I'm just saying from the alcohol piece, I didn't know if that's law about the public dollars. I didn't know about the transportation. This is strictly for meal per diem.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is meals and incidentals and it is, yeah, it is pay.
And an incidental is,
a pop or a snack.
Okay.
Because that's another thing.
they tend to be more expensive in the hotels anyway than the
'Cause that's another
meals.
thing we don't pay for. If
Gotcha.
you're thirsty and you want to get the pop machine, well, it's on you. So,
Yeah,
yeah, and so because the employee,
Makes
because we're
sense.
paying the employee, it's not, public dollar being paid to the employee, and then they have kind of the flexibility.
It'll save board staff.
Their ethical
Time.
behavior, so.
Laura?
I was just going to add, I may have said this at the last meeting when this was discussed, but I do believe it will lessen our audit risk as well because we have
Right.
fewer transactions going through P card, less material that we as a
Love it.
district need to process, and less transactions our external audits will have to choose from.
Rob, if you'll go 2 more slides, please. So just, and we don't have to spend a lot of time on this. It's just, next one, please. It's kind of the flow chart of how it would work.
Just like that pie chart. If pie chart, if there's more than 6 in this, for a flow chart, if there's more than 8, get rid of it.
That's
Bring it
3
down
separate
from 5.
processes. We went from 5 boxes to 4. I think that's a win.
Congratulations.
I do think, and again, I think this is another one, like, the policy itself will be something that is very efficient to bring us less, like, brings us more consistent with how we do stuff and around the district. But I think the other part for me is the back and forth of disputes is also what is part of that time consuming part. And I know that was when we looked at it from an audit committee standpoint. Yeah, like the person bringing you the wrong copy of
Oh,
the receipt
please.
or that's not itemized on there, so you don't know what it's on, so now you gotta go find out what you did, or I remember my own example is getting a parking receipt and like having to figure out, okay, did it give me the right receipt when the machine didn't work with the receipt? Who do I call? Like these type of things, when you're doing food, gets really complicated, especially for folks who are going for multiple days of a travel.
So there's an education component here because it's. The employee's gonna be using their own credit card or the cash, but and then get reimbursed. And so that's gonna be a culture change for people.
It's for some folks.
Yeah.
That's a rollout too of just, we have new policy, once the policy is informed when it starts, doing some stuff beforehand to get
Right.
sure everybody's on tracks and understanding.
Yeah, we are,
That's not different than anytime we change the other policies.
So are we okay with moving this to policy?
I don't, yeah.
Well, I could almost go the whole board, probably.
I'm pretty sure the board would love. it. I believe that is the last of our policies.
Yeah.
Um. It's a party going on outside. The beat is.
It's fun to work at CPS.
So the other topic should just be real quick, but the first on the budget timeline is that we did send the initial staffing out, draft staffing out on January 10th. It went through a pretty quick preliminary review because of the compressed timeline to get to the deadline. And so that right now the staffing appeals process is underway for people to say, oh, this is an error. I don't, we disagree with this. We need something else. So that ends on the 23rd. And then the appeals team will review and finalize items, and then transfer rounds begin after that. So, any questions on timeline?
What formula are we using to determine the staffing?
The same formulas we've been using for the last 20 years.
And that one is, I mean, that's
25-1 at K-3, 32 to 4 to 6 and 7, 8, and 9, 12 is done by a team of people that know high school scheduling.
That's good. The reason I say that, if you'll recall, one of the very earliest of our super long meetings, I think when Superintendent Wright was here, and we had to go through that awful line item by line item night and voting, and it was like 1 o'clock in the morning, if I recall, and that was just leaving the building. That wasn't even getting home. I know that we had a long discussion about budgeting and staffing at the top of the range for class size. And I know that there was discussion, now we have a different administration, but there was discussion that indeed there was going to be an effort to move toward the lower numbers of the range. Because it seems really weird to me that actually, and I can't say anything about any contract because we're in negotiations, but my point is, it's almost as though we have bigger class sizes because of the actual possible contractual language
Well-
and ranges that it provides us as we staff.
I do think the discussion though started from, we don't have full staffing even at the high numbers, so we would need more staffing for the low numbers. So like the idea was that
Mhm.
we had to fill it. What we know from this year is we still didn't fill all the spots we had open.
Right.
So I mean, I think there is a reality to say we can make efforts to get towards those roles. We'd have to hire people and have budget to hire people for those roles. I do think one factor though that will probably affect what next year's numbers actually end up looking like, is not basically what we budgeted for, is what we end up negotiating as far as contractual language. So while we are budgeting and putting together ideas and that kind of deal, I think we are long-term going to have to think about in each of the schools, what it looks like. What are these things going to look like from a past this year's budget? Or next year's budget, I should say, discussion. Because in theory, we are not getting new revenue. In fact, some ways we're probably getting less per student. And so that is something that certainly the class size is a topic. I think maybe more nuanced from that sense of what does each level of schooling need? What does each school need, right? Based on the
Per school,
resources
per
it needs.
student.
But it's something we definitely as a board can have that discussion around as we look at budget discussions at our workshop. But I think for right now, we have to kind of work with what we have as the standard that until we change the standard.
Until we get new formulas, right?
I'm all in favor of those new formulas. And those are not necessarily the district invented formulas. Those are contractual formulas
Those are contractual formulas, that's
or
correct.
ranges, I should
And so
say.
if I remember correctly, when we looked at last year of changing to the
112.
minimums, it was $13 million increase.
There's 112 more teachers or something like that.
And so which is great, that if that's a priority of the district, that's a priority of the district, but that $13 million is going to come out of central office or operations somewhere.
Or other choices to be made. I
Other
mean,
choices.
but we're not being afforded that choice. And rightfully, and I won't say rightfully so, but I'm just saying that might be a choice people want to make. And indeed, it might be that across the board, and this is the point, is that the class size at one of our high schools may not be the right class size at another one of our high schools, or elementaries, for the very reason that, you know,
I do think
Whatever.
though, having that discussion as to class size also must start with, did we employ the folks to be in those roles? Because we end up with a class of 62 because we had put a bunch of people in the room. We don't have teachers for that class. We're not actually doing class size then either, right? So I think there is a conversation point to have around what is our goal from a negotiations conversation. And then there's also the point of, we need to find people, we need to hire people, we need to put people in some of these roles, because
certainly
And
elevates
we-
recruitment.
and in some ways, this past year's budget, or this current year's budget, we formulated with the understanding that we weren't going to be able to fill certain roles. And I think the
Mhm.
reality is, if we did fill them and had full staffing, we wouldn't have had the space in some ways to do some of the things we did. So it is a conversation point of, where do we pull dollars from? Where do we move
There you
dollars
go.
here? What do we make our priorities? Which is leading into the last part of, with our budget workshop planning. That's stuff that I do think the board needs to be upfront with the superintendent and the treasurer about.
Mhm.
Because if we come in and say, this is our priority, and then we later come back and say, hey, superintendent, now
We
we really want you to
changed.
have this part
Yes.
as our priority, so get rid of something else. That's not fair to the superintendent or the treasurer and how they're trying to put together our long-term budget.
And
Which is kind of, I think, what we've unfortunately been stuck with doing at times, is because we haven't made the hard decision up front.
I really emphasize that we should really spend the vast majority of Saturday talking about some of these big issues, philosophical, as well as implementation and budget priorities. We've gone through almost 3 months, 3 years of the budget part gets kicked to the bottom, or not done. I mean, we tried to recoup a little bit, but I just think it wouldn't be a bad idea to get our brains around that
Mhm.
and make that suggestion if, to the president.
So, the notes I took for the work session agenda, or workshop, whatever we're calling it, is budget, levy, centralized versus decentralized, in-source versus outsource, class size, cash set aside. And then I know the superintendent has a list of budgetary priorities for next year.
Fantastic.
And I think this speaks a little bit to, and I think we talked about it at the December meeting, but I think it's good to refresh. We are taking the approach this year of looking at everything from like going back to zero and saying, let's
Hallelujah.
rebuild your budget based on, okay, first start with what are your mandatories, like your things you have to spend money on. And then now we look at priorities of what's the next levels of spending. And so that's helpful in us having a discussion at the workshop. We'll be able to kind of give the
Let's
board
do that.
view. Because I think that was the other part of us trying to do it without having that starting point, is that everybody just took their
Mhm.
previous year budget and said, well, I'm doing the exact same things I did last year plus. And
Right.
there's no.
We can't afford it. You know, and then the political scene is they want to take more money away from public education.
Yeah.
So we can't, you've heard me say this before, we can't continue to business the way we're doing it and stay out of cash trouble.
Hallelujah.
um,
Amen.
Using the same formulas will get us into trouble.
There you go.
Seriously, we cut so much out of central office this year that we are struggling to serve our customers. You can't continue to squeeze down central office or you'll become non-compliant.
Well, this is an old publication, as we had to change offices. It's from 2002, and it highlighted Houston and Milwaukee and Cincinnati about budgeting. The zero base, student base, 3 innovative districts, and it might not be a bad idea to go back to some of our roots.
But true student-based budgeting doesn't work in a district with high mobility throughout the year. And that's what got us into, you know, we had schools that ended up in a loan. They had to borrow money from the district
I
to
understand.
finish out the year. And so, yeah. Going back to student needs.
Yep.
would
And
be,
students
yes,
instead of class size. But
Yes.
This is great. This is all cool stuff.
It's fun discussion for us.
great.
Last major topic that we had is just the Just Ask Jen upcoming.
Yeah, so we, excuse me, yes, so we had to cancel January 7th because of
Weather,
White Death. So.
the W word.
So that was
Weather.
gonna be on how do we spend our money, but that could easily be rolled into the budgetary, instead of looking at current year, look at next year. So we're good with that. So the next one is scheduled for federal grants, Title I. We can sneak in the ESSER conversation into that one.
Rest in peace. We can do a sort of a dirge, the drum beat.
Yeah, everybody wear, yeah, okay.
All wear black.
And we can have background music, Rob. Thank you.
Go New Orleans style.
New Orleans, that's right.
In March, we were going to talk about the treasure dashboard and our performance measures, and then the role of the internal audit function and how it's important to the district. In April, we wanted to invite some of our legislators in to talk about the impact that their behavior has on financial districts.
For the Jen thing?
Just ask Jen, yes.
Okay, because I know that it was Vice President Weinberg was lining up that legislative breakfast or something. So
Yeah.
let's look at that.
Okay.
Makes
Yep.
sense.
And that was a topic that was offered by Dr. Moffett at the time.
Yes, or it came from somewhere
Yeah.
beyond, yeah. And then the May, we actually discovered through Superintendent Murphy that it actually conflicted with the graduation ceremony.
Oops.
And so I've offered other dates, and I don't know when Finance Committee members would be available. We might want to wait for Mr. Crossett to come back before we pick that. And then the last one being the handoff.
That's what.
Cool.
We'll have to have tissues.
Yeah.
What's that? I didn't hear you. What was that, Ms.
What
Murphy?
color for that?
Yeah, I think I will need a box of tissues.
No, you will. You'll be a mess.
3 more months of work, so. Last thing, just, done at each of the meetings before, just covering some topics we'll talk about next meeting. One is the work plan for the committee. We revised the work plan last year to kind of update and make sure we were kind of looking really at some of the budgetary things and then also taking off stuff we don't do. There is a version of this from last year's work plan that is on board docs for folks to check out. We'll also need to start looking at levy, because we gotta have a conversation on what the levy will be, what the dollar amount we're gonna look for, what we wanna do with it, yada, yada, yada.
And Mike and I had a great meeting with David Conley yesterday around some opportunities surrounding the bond levy and strategies around the renewal levy. And so we wanted to schedule some time to bring in Brenda, David, Kent Cashel, and have a conversation with the board and about all the different strategies, because sometimes they're a little bit complex, but.
We'll do the under 200, hopefully, vendor contract performance evaluation that we've been doing. And then.
Is that for next month or, okay?
Next one. And then one other thing that is just of a conversation that we started having a little bit last year with regard to, since we're doing consent agendas, reevaluating the thought process about whether or not, like how we use the treasurer's report. And so one thought process that had been offered and thought about was doing more like a comprehensive monthly one, and then at the other meetings, we would have whatever whatever other stuff came up. The thought process from the treasurer was that would also then require some needs to address authorizations in order to ensure that things got paid on time. So we just want to have that discussion as well as to whether or not that's something the committee would recommend or think about. We didn't really dive too far into it before. But otherwise, are there any folks who wanted to say anything online? I can't go to Michelle.
No one made a request.
All righty, Michelle,
I just had a quick comment as it relates to ESSER.
Michelle.
can we slide the mic down to Michelle?
Is this on?
Okay, just a quick comment as we talk about ESSER dollars. I really appreciate the graph charts to show the breakdown and also the evolution of the use of the dollars and how responsible we were. And just imagine if we were adequately, fully funded by the federal government for public education in this country. I mean, just a perspective, right? That this $325 million is really not even as much as we're really due in terms of public education in this country. We've been short shrifted since the beginning, really, on federal infusion of public dollars for our children. And so, you know, while we might make jokes about it going away, wouldn't it be nice if that was really a permanent part of our budget? If we were finally fully adequately funded?
$100 million.
Because we have shown and demonstrated that when we get federal dollars, we use them responsibly and it goes where it should go. So I just want to offer that observation. Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle.
The fight to even maintain what we were doing with Title I dollars is still on in the federal government. So I think it is worthwhile to always say, if the federal government actually invested in public education the way they say they value public education in some parts, it would be much more opportunities, especially in districts like ours, where we've shown that we can use the funds in a responsible way. With nothing else, I bid you all adieu and call the meeting adjourned, and we'll figure out a